Welcome to the Great Divorce Podcast, hosted by divorce financial analyst and retirement planning counselor Andrew Hatherley. Join Andrew and guest experts as they help late-life divorcees build the financial and mental foundation for a meaningful future. There is life after divorce. Now, on to the show.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 42 of the Great Divorce Podcast. My guest today is Maria Natapov. Maria is a step-parenting coach and works with her clients to help them confidently blend their families. As the daughter of divorced immigrant parents and a step-parent herself, Maria understands blended families' communication and connection challenges and the importance of healing pain and preventing further harm by establishing innovative parenting support systems. Through her four-step process, combined with rapid resolution therapy, Maria helps families transition from chaos to harmony. She enables step-parents to strengthen their values, foster partner alignment, create trust with stepchildren, and enhance community with birth families by building on their existing skills, experiences, and strengths. Maria also hosts her own podcast called Synergistic Step Parenting. Maria, welcome to the Great Divorce Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Well, very excited to have you here today. And I guess step parenting coach, I have to admit that I wasn't aware that such a coaching specialty existed. And I'm wondering if you might give us an overview of what you do. And then more importantly, how did you get into that? Well, why do you do what you do? But what is a step parenting coach?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I work with the step parent and and also the sometimes single parent who is starting to date or in various stages of dating. Maybe it's the beginning stages and maybe they're further along and maybe they're even about to blend their families, or possibly that blend is already underway. And I help them really navigate the turbulent waters because it can be very, very challenging for all involved in those situations. Step parents can feel extremely isolated because they're like a fish out of water. Having been a step parent, I'm speaking from experience. In spite of even, my experience, even though I'm an immigrant, in my own personal experience as a step parent, I was very fluent with the language, very familiar with the culture. I grew up here, and nonetheless, it was very much a fish out of water. And I was shocked that it reminded me of my immigration experience when I didn't know the language and didn't know the culture, because they're just rhythms to the family that we often don't realize and establish sort of inside jokes and shorthand for various things. Everybody already kind of knows the expected maybe responses or quirks or preferences of each other, and they just take it for granted because it's second nature. Whereas this individual coming into all of this, it's brand new to them. Not to mention every person within the step family unit has their own sort of needs and expectations of this brand new person coming in. So it can be quite challenging for this brand new individual. And conversely, for the single parent, it can also feel challenging because they want to do right by their children. They also want to do right by themselves, and they're excited to get their life moving, and they've met somebody or are possibly about to meet somebody that they really want to move forward with. But it's challenging, and they can often feel torn. And let's not forget, whenever there has been a divorce that a family is recovering from, there are deep wounds. There can be, loyalty binds for kids between parents, and they're not quite sure how to feel about this new person. They can also kind of feel like this new person is sort of trying to replace their other parent, or possibly that they are, kind of getting into their parent's head, the parent that is the partner of this new individual. And so that can cause tension. Or possibly if this new individual, if they have different kind of ideas, values, perhaps different ways of doing things, or maybe they're not making enough of an effort, or it doesn't seem like they're making enough of an effort to integrate into the family or be a part of the family, or perhaps making too much of an effort and it feels like they're just constantly there trying to insert themselves into everything. It's a lot to navigate. So those are the kinds of things that I help people with, assist them with, guide them through, support them through.
Now, you mentioned your own experience as a step parent. I'm
Yes.
curious how you got into this field,
Yeah.
and how you.
Yes. Thank you. I just realized I didn't answer your second question. My apologies. So I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. I was an immigrant. We immigrated with my family when I was a kid. My parents were already separated at that point. They pretty much had a very tumultuous relationship as far back as I can remember, though they were not officially divorced yet. My mom needed permission of both parents for the government to allow her to leave. So she was like, my dad didn't want her to just take me. So she said, come with us. So we all immigrated together with my maternal grandparents. And shortly after, they did, in fact, separate. My dad left, wasn't really around much. And then officially, they got divorced when I was about 13. And the immigration took place when I was 8 years old. So I grew up as a child of divorce. And then in high school and college, respectively, each one of them remarried. So I was also very familiar and had experience with being a stepchild and having step siblings and having to navigate all the things with one parent being further away. So I didn't see him as much, and the other parent being kind of more close by. And so those dynamics were more kind of prevalent. And it wasn't easy. It really was not easy. And maybe this was exacerbated a little bit in my personal culture, my personal situation. We didn't talk much about feelings, and there certainly were a lot of them. And I didn't know how to make sense of all of them. And we're sort of very like heated, like we love hard and loud and big. And so the emotions and unfortunately the conflict used to be really big, but we wouldn't really deal with it or process it or do anything about it. It would just sort of, we move on. It just sort of ends and then we move on. And I found that kind of maddening personally. And, I didn't realize like my family, they loved me so fiercely and they meant well, but there's certain natural cultural things, right? Or perhaps intergenerational things that exist as far as dynamics, how we handle things, how we show up to different conversations, what we can and can't handle. For example, being conflict avoidant, for example, or perhaps, you know, maybe like just not really wanting to take accountability, right, for things. And perhaps, and those kinds of things are exactly what we end up bringing with us into new relationships. And it can be, again, subconscious. Nobody's intending to do this, but these are things that follow us until they get resolved, until we're able to pause, take a look at what they are, process them, and also learn some new skills so that we can take a different approach, right? Because otherwise, unfortunately, if we don't address it, it usually leads often to the same outcome over and over again. So that for me was really important. And personally, I ended up falling into an unhealthy relationship. It was abusive physically and emotionally. It took me a very long time to leave because I happened to get into it as a teenager, which naturally you're still growing and evolving. And so the bond was extremely strong. I didn't actually get the courage to leave until my early 30s. And then when I did leave, I met my now husband who had a daughter. And I really strongly try to persuade him to not go after someone like me because he needed a better role model for his daughter.
How old was
But
his daughter?
she was, so when I ended up meeting her, which was our like make or break point, she was turning 7 years old. It was literally her birthday weekend. And essentially at that point, we had already flushed everything out and we're like, okay, we're good. Either if we get her the green light from her, we move forward, or this is the end of our road and hopefully we can remain friends. Um, so I realized he mentioned to me, and it took me a little while to really sit with this, but he said, because I had experiences where I didn't necessarily get what I had hoped I would or felt like I needed, that would make me a better caregiver than I was giving myself credit for. So it took me a little while to really process that. And then I realized that has some wisdom to it. And I just knew I was ready to make the commitment to her. And that was when, we decided to embark on that part of our lives. And thankfully, in my case, it worked out. But unfortunately, 5 years into my step parenting role, she revealed that she was being abused and neglected by mom and stepdad, with whom she had been living during the week. And it had been going on for 5 years, pretty much the whole time, but she was being silenced. And so that was obviously, we would have never guessed that was happening for her. And we acted really quickly. She ended up coming to live with us full time. The custody battle took a year and a half, but she did end up, my husband ended up getting full physical custody of her. But again, I just can't stress enough how kids need so much support often, much, much more than they will ever let on through these situations. And thankfully, I'm not even talking when there's abuse involved. I'm just saying in general, because there's just so many emotions that they are navigating. And for them, they don't have the life experience. They don't have the fully developed, mature brain to make sense of it all. And even to simply know that it's going to be okay, because in their lives, all they've ever known is their core family unit. So when that ends, their whole sense of security is rocked. So yeah, just that's really the reason that I got into it. When I joined blended family support groups, I didn't realize that. I thought we're having an extra hard time because of some of the challenges that I pointed out. But then I saw that a lot of other people were struggling just with the cohesion component of the blend. And many of them were feeling isolated, and many of them were talking about turning to drugs sometimes, or alcohol and these other things, or not wanting to be home because they just felt like there was no room for them. And that's when I realized, okay, like this, I've learned some survival skills around these things just from having the life that I did. And I would love to share those with people and support them through this, because it doesn't have to be as difficult as it seemed like it was for many.
Boy, I can really relate to your story from a parallel angle of how I became a divorce financial analyst. And it was going
Mhm.
through my own rather difficult, somewhat complex divorce. And through the mistakes that I made and the things that I learned, I realized that I could offer so much more value in my work by trying to inspire people to A, avoid some of the mistakes that I did, but it's B, also benefit from some of the important lessons that I learned.
Mhm.
And with you, Maria, you were both a stepchild at, for someone at one stage
Mhm.
in your late teens, if I understood you
Yeah.
correctly, which was
Yep.
probably challenging for both you and your step parent at the time.
Yeah.
Um, and then you became a step parent later in life, and your stepdaughter was 7. So,
Mhm.
which brings up such a wide field, because you mentioned the intercultural issues, the personality issues. I love your metaphor about the language, and the language with which the existing family to which you come in has their own methods of communication. That's a that's a very, very profound metaphor. But,
Thank you.
you know, this being obviously, this is the gray divorce podcast, and the focus tends to be on older adult children. And I did a podcast on this a while ago, but it just seems that you must experience in your work as a step parenting coach so many different dynamics of
Mhm.
somebody coming into being a step parent for a 7-year-old, to being to being a step parent for a 17-year-old. And then
Mhm.
in the gray divorce world, you could be a step parent for someone who's 37 or even 47 years old. So there's all these different life stages here. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering, how do you analyze the situation when you meet with somebody? And I assume that you work with wide range of ages in this. I'm assuming you work with great people getting
Yeah.
divorced over the age of 50 and then getting into relationships.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
what are some kind of general themes that you see based on this range, this age range, or this life range,
Mhm.
life stage range, between both the step parents and the step children?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention yet, but every situation is completely unique, because in some cases, the step parent wants to be more involved and they feel that they either can't, or that they're not being welcomed, or they're feeling some resistance, or maybe they're also kind of second guessing because they don't want to be disrespectful to the parent. And in other cases, they are not necessarily wanting to put in as much effort, especially when it comes to, for example, with adult children. They often feel, I think there's just generally sometimes a little bit of an assumption on everybody's part that if a person is like an older teenager into adulthood, that they don't need, the tender love and care to essentially create a relationship. And also that there's an element of it, like they understand what's going on, they can just get over it type of thing. And the reality is these are extremely emotional situations. And this is somebody's, most core sort of family unit. And I think it's an unrealistic assumption, and it's unfair because it's also, I think, one of the pieces that leads to the misconception is maybe logically, yes, we understand these things. But the reality is, when we're experiencing something, when we're living through it, we're not being logical because there's a whole emotional component to our mind that is calling all the shots. And we have to be able to address both. Right. Like we have to be able to address the situation on both levels. And I think in general, it requires more attentiveness and more intentional steps on both sides, I suppose, to really make things work.
Well,
Is my best answer. I know it's very vague, but
well, you talk about teenagers and needing tender loving care, but you probably recognize that, or at least my experience is teenagers will certainly pretend that they don't want tender loving care.
1,000%. Yes.
Maybe the younger teenagers, there's always the stereotypical, you're not my dad or you're not my mom. That
Yeah.
thing is probably, more among the preteens and the teens, as opposed to the younger children who may not even, the very younger children may be much easier for the step parent to develop a relationship with
Yeah, it
them.
depends yes, it depends on how well the other parent is doing. That will definitely play a role on how they're adjusting. It also depends on, just in general, how much structure there is for them, how much stability, how much they're feeling that they have a voice and that they are able to get the nurture that they're needing at any given point. If, for example, they're perceiving that suddenly mom's or dad's new partner is more important than they are, like maybe mom and dad is suddenly less available to spend time with them, or there's suddenly no one-on-one time, and they don't even feel that they can approach them with a concern or a question or anything without this other person being there. And maybe they're getting the sense that this other person has sort of, that they tend to jump in with like resolving something or their own ideas about something instead of the mom or the dad taking the lead. That can cause some issues. So, additionally, if their other parent, maybe a lot of times when after the divorce, one parent tends to move on faster than another one. They're maybe a little bit more ready, or maybe just things happen that way. And sometimes the other parent is just not okay. They're still mourning. They're still, it's still very much messy for them, and they're struggling. And if the child is seeing that struggle, and I don't mean, like it's okay to be sad, right? But the key is, if the child is experiencing or witnessing more than your typical like sad moment, and that it feels like mom is not okay or dad is not okay. So maybe they're really angry. Maybe suddenly they're like behaving in a way that is very different than they used to. So for example, like if they used to always keep the house tidy and suddenly it's a mess, or vice versa, right? Like any of those kinds of changes, it's jarring, and kids are extremely perceptive, and they might not know exactly how to pinpoint or say what it is, but they can sense something is wrong. And that creates a lot of chaos for them. And so that may also play a role in, the whole dynamic, and they might kind of, create more of a resistance towards this new partner because they're perceiving it in their small mind, in their young mind, that, they're the issue. They're the one causing it. And this is why it's so important to talk to kids about that. I will also say that there, I think, is a major misconception. So generally speaking, we're thinking, oh, teenagers, they just want to be left alone. Like they don't like anything. They're, maybe the word emo, the terminology emo comes to mind. But the reality is, oftentimes, that's an indication something is wrong and they actually need more support, right? Because when kids know or are able to do better, they do. Nobody's sitting there wanting to be miserable or to make somebody else's life miserable. If they're if it seems like there's constantly attitude or behavior that is concerning, that is an indication that they need more support. That is an indication that something is wrong and needs to be addressed. And usually they are needing their parents primarily. They might need additional supports as well, like possibly therapy or coaching or what have you. But the key is, and the most effective way that they can be supported is through their parent. That is the physiological need that they always have.
Through their
That is the
biological
person that
parents, you mean?
yes, exactly.
Mhm.
So they are needing that support because they're needing that connection because that is what they're wired for. And oftentimes, if they're not getting that, that is when a lot of these situations can really kind of implode, I guess, if you will.
Yes, it's interesting because before after I was divorced and before I remarried and while I would occasionally have date women with children
Mhm.
and anytime I would ask questions about the dynamic many times no, many times, maybe 50-50. But the woman might respond, I'm not looking for a father for my children. They have a father.
Right.
And I never knew quite how to respond to that. But I guess the idea was to A, put me at ease, but B, also for her to acknowledge what you just said about the importance of the biological parents and that they maintain this healthy communication with their children about what's going on in their lives.
Yeah, that is so critical. But I will point out that there's a small caveat there because inevitably, this person coming in, they're going to be some sort of a caregiver or caregiver support
Right.
role. So I think it's so critical not to divorce them from that entirely
Mhm.
because otherwise that feels unstable too. It's like, oh, this is just like a guest who won't leave and is constantly hanging around. And the other piece is, sometimes, and it of course depends on the person and kind of their general perspective or outlook, I suppose, and possibly age. But sometimes in even a marriage, one parent just tended to be more around or perhaps more available or just spent more time with the kids for whatever reason. And even after the divorce, even though now it seems like the trend is, and we're seeing that the other parent often is wanting to pick up more of the responsibility because they genuinely want the 50-50 situation. So they're willing to learn and put in the effort and put in the time and energy to doing whatever is necessary to be done to be and kind of step up, if you will, for lack of a better terminology, to those responsibilities. The other parent might not be ready, but they certainly often are not ready for like a new partner to come in and play a role. And I'm not suggesting that they play a role. However, just as um, just as like a new person coming in with a fresh perspective who is around and is witnessing certain things, they may have some really valuable insights just for you as the parent to learn or hear or take into consideration. So, not suggesting the step parent comes in and is now involved in parenting or caregiving. That is often assessed on a case by case
Well,
situation where it's available, appropriate, et cetera. But those insights are really valuable and certainly worth considering at the very least for the parent behind closed doors, just in their one-on-one conversations, rather than just dismissing this person as, no, they know nothing about my kids. They're absolutely like, they will have absolutely no say. It's not about giving them say, but they have a valuable perspective.
no, it's very important what you were saying about the stage as well, because I could see that perhaps the incoming step parent who may be in their late 20s or late 30s, they may want to have a role in
Yeah,
raising children much more than a step parent who's in their 50s or 60s, who's
right.
been there, done that, and besides, the children are already well into adulthood.
Sure. But again, like this brings up, there's still always milestones, right? Like for adult children, there may be weddings, there might be things with kids like births and then suddenly birthday parties and children's plays and activities and those kinds of milestones. And I think it can be easy to overlook and just say, oh, I'm really like, I'm not a part of this. This is all like your mom or your dad. And I'm just here as a bystander or whatever. But the reality is, that can also create the rift possibly, or the parent can suddenly feel torn between, oh, well, do I take the extra trip and go and support my kids or my grandkids, or do I stay behind with, my significant other because maybe they're uncomfortable or they're just feeling left out, right? And so I think it's really valuable to just make yourself available, and not necessarily like force and certainly not come in if it doesn't feel like there's a place, but just even little things to make the effort, I think goes a really long way, because then it at least paves the way for something to possibly open up down the line, right? And just sort of that willingness, I guess, is really valuable to put out there.
Because there are so many different types of situations and personalities and cultures, um, and I mean culture not only in terms of nationally, but also the family culture, like discussed
Yeah.
before. Your work, I'm imagining that your work has to be very much tailored. I mean, I assume that you have a process
Hmm.
but you need to understand the dynamic and filter that through the process. So how
Yes.
can you explain a little bit about how you work with people to learn to understand their situation and perhaps see that we need to put we need to put stress in this particular area for this client situation, whereas another one
Yeah.
might be completely different.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Well, I have extensive questionnaires that my clients will answer, or soon to be clients will answer, and to give me a really good idea of where things are at and what's going on. And usually, right, like people don't really come to me unless there's an issue that they're trying to resolve. And so it also depends on what is the issue and what is the goal, right? And then it also, I have to take into consideration what is available, because just because one person might look at that as a goal, as we explore together more the nuances and the details of the situation and what they maybe have tried and haven't tried, and sort of just the general dynamics that are at play, that might inform us, that usually informs us as to where the other person is at. And then it's a matter of trying to distinguish whether that individual is also has the same goal or not. And sometimes when it comes to, adults, the beautiful thing is, as I work together with the step parent or perhaps the divorced parent, we can invite the other parties into the conversation if that feels like it would be a useful thing to do. Like if we're feeling like we're at a standstill and we've tried some things and it's just not working. Oftentimes I do prefer to work with people one-on-one, because I want to make sure they have agency and are able to take what we're discussing and the skills that we're, fostering together, and are able to apply them to create the change within their dynamic. But if for whatever reason we're at a standstill and it feels like maybe we're missing something, then it's useful to invite other voices into the conversation. And that often helps to clear up any misconception, or perhaps points out something else that needs to be worked through first.
So you mentioned adults. You're talking about the adult children of gray divorce. You'll bring them into the conversation.
If appropriate and if they're willing to, yes. It also sometimes might just be their other partner, right? Like some of this might just be, a lot of times people are just not on the same page about parenting, or even about what the expectations for a situation should be, especially things involving kids. Sometimes it has to do with financial things. Sometimes it has to do with execution or just responsibilities, perhaps. Oftentimes the parent is a bit more lenient as far as, what what the expectations should be. And the step parent is like, no, they need structure, they need discipline, you need to you need to
Exactly.
create boundaries.
Exactly.
And that's a really common one that often causes tension.
Yeah.
And I hear so often, like, we don't fight, we never fight until the kids are here, or until it's something about the kids. And that's a really valuable and important component, because also, when they met, they knew that there are kids in the picture. That's what it
R-
is.
Right.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
but if you haven't had kids, you never really prepared for what's going to
Right.
come.
Right. And I think it's a really beautiful opportunity for that growth, right? And the reality is too, I think it's really beautiful when people can grow together. And growth doesn't always mean necessarily doing something different. Sometimes it just means accepting something that you didn't realize, or something that is maybe that you found difficult before, or even bothersome, or something you don't agree with. Sometimes it's just the acceptance of, yeah, like this is going to be different. This isn't going to occur the way that I would have, handled this, but that's okay. And also, it's not my call to make. And in other situations, it's a matter of growing through together and realizing the value of the other person's input, and realizing, oh yeah, maybe perhaps the way I've been approaching it hasn't really been working so well. Maybe it is worth it to look at things in a new way. Because the other thing that can happen for parents is they've been with these kids all their lives, so they might be seeing them in a different way, meaning that kids are always evolving, right? As adults, we're constantly changing. Life is happening to us, and we're becoming different all the time. And yet, as parents, as a younger version of ourselves, or just a different version of ourselves that we were earlier on in life, and they might not be seeing the new changes that are occurring. And so that might, in and of itself, to a degree, be a hindrance in even how they're supporting their kids. So there's just lots to really consider and think about, and that's at play.
Well, I appreciate your emphasis on growth, because one of the areas of this podcast and my work with people going through mid to late life divorce is personal growth after the divorce. And often, with the divorce happening to people later in life, they're realizing that, they may have a limited amount of time to fulfill some of the dreams or ambitions that they've wanted, and maybe they have time to um, focus on themselves in a way that perhaps they couldn't when they were in the really in the workplace, and about when they were maturing and then going through work and going through raising kids. And then they hit their late 50s and 60s and think, okay, now I need to focus on this that's always interested me all my life. But
Mhm.
anyway, long-winded way of getting to the question of how do you see situations with step parents to adult children in gray divorce? Any particular commonalities there, or any particular advice you would recommend to people remarrying after gray divorce and entering a situation with adult stepchildren?
I mean, I think that a common one is that children often get rocked, like if their parents, especially almost in a way, when their parents seem to have had these happy lives, and then suddenly they're getting divorced, and maybe, again, oftentimes children are very perceptive, and they notice that, things aren't really working. Like sometimes I hear from people, oh, I wish my parents just got divorced way earlier than they did. I don't understand why they stuck it out for us. It was awful. However, in those situations where it really is just like what you're saying, like maybe it's not so much that it's a bad marriage, but maybe they just kind of have grown apart, and they're realizing that they don't have very much time, and they just want to go and pursue other things, and they just realize they're better off as friends, for example. I think the key is that for children, it really rocks, again, their sense of security, and makes them question, oh, is my marriage going to also end in divorce, right? Like what led to this? And it just makes them kind of fearful about what is to come for themselves, and how to prevent it. And, and especially when, right, like conflict is so common, it would be strange not to have some conflict. The question usually is, how do we resolve that conflict? How do we handle it? But then it starts to be, oh no, is this fight going to be the thing that breaks us apart? And what about the kids? And what about, right? And all these fears and questions come into play. And the statistics, unfortunately, are not very favorable either. So that's not something to kind of calm our nerves, unfortunately. So yeah, I think that those are the commonalities. And so I think, again, the key really is just to create honest conversations around this, and to can't stress this enough, but like truly just remind the kids, like, hey, we're still your parents. We're not divorcing from that responsibility just
Right.
because mom and dad, mom and I, or dad and I didn't work out, or just because like this is where we found ourselves, and just kind of having some compassion around that.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. You know, one specific question I wanted to ask, because I hear so many people respond differently to this, and I've experienced it in different ways, is when is a good time for the single parent to introduce this new romantic interest into his or her children's lives, whether the children be 7 or 57?
Yeah, great question. And I get that one a lot. And I think my common piece of advice around that is feel your kids out before you do it. It just helps because it gives you a sense of where they're at. So like, hey, how do you feel about me dating right now? What if I find somebody, or what if I meet somebody tomorrow? How do you feel about that? What comes up for you? And it just gives them an idea of what's going on for their kids, right? What are they thinking? What are they fearing? And it helps them to better prepare for what they might expect or what they might encounter, what kinds of questions, what kinds of things possibly they'd need to work through around that. So that's kind of my standard piece of advice. I firmly stand by that one.
Sounds good. Look, there's so much we could continue talking for hours about this subject. There's so much. If for any listeners who'd like to learn more about your services as a step parenting coach, how can they find you?
Yeah, they can always feel free to DM me. I'm on LinkedIn. At my handle is Synergistic Step Parenting, or also on Facebook. And I think I'm Maria Natapov on that one. And they also can just go to my website, which is synergisticstepparenting.com. And that has the podcast, and that has, a whole host of ways that they can reach out to me.
Terrific. Maria, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much. This was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Great Divorce Podcast. To learn more or get in contact with your host, you can visit Andrew's website at transcendretirement.net. Also, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. That helps others find the show, and we'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
Information provided is educational only and should not be construed as legal or tax advice. Each situation is unique and should be discussed with your tax or legal advisor prior to implementation. Andrew Hatherley is not an attorney and does not provide legal advice. Information provided is financial in nature. Advisory services offered through Hatherley Capital Management, LLC. Divorce financial analysis services offered through Wiser Divorce Solutions, an affiliated company.